All right, folks. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the February edition of Village Voices. I'm Mary Bloodworth with Capitol Hill Village, standing in for our globe-trotting moderator, Trudy Peterson. We have a very interesting program for you tonight, but first, a few announcements. We'd like to acknowledge Trudy Peterson for all the work she does to put into curating this series. Village Voices would not happen without her. Jean Daniels does fabulous publicity for the events. And of course, thanks to Judy Berman for running all aspects of CHV and making it look easy. I'd like to invite you all to mute yourselves until we hit the question and answer portion of the night. If you think of a question and are worried that you'll forget it, put it in the chat and we'll respond at the appropriate time. You can also raise your hand under the reactions menu at the bottom of the screen. Looking to the future, in March, Village Voices hosts Fergus Bordowich on Tuesday, March 5th. He is the author of 9 nonfiction books, the latest of which is Clan War, Ulysses S. Grant, and the Battle to Save Reconstruction. Join us on March 5th and prepare to learn the uncomfortable parallels with events 150 years ago. Then in April, we will have Barbara Charles on Tuesday, April 9th for a ride on a carousel. Now we turn to tonight's guest. Binyamin Applebaum is the lead writer on economics and business for the New York Times editorial board. The economics of housing has been one of his constant concerns, focusing on state rules that impact the area's housing availability, including a critique of the role of the historic districts in the availability of affordable housing. Tonight, he will discuss why Washington doesn't have enough housing and what we can do about it. I turn the floor over to you.
Hi, thanks very much. It's very nice to be with all of you this evening. I'd just add by way of introduction that I'm a resident of Capitol Hill. I've lived here for 15 years now, which I know is probably not much by some of your standards, but it's the longest I've lived anywhere. It's our home, and we love living here. So when I received this invitation, I thought I was really glad to have it. And I'm looking forward to talking with all of you this evening. I'm sorry, was someone interrupting to say something? No, maybe not. So I'm going to talk for a little while, and then I'm going to open up to questions. I'm going to make sure I leave a lot of time for questions because I enjoy the discussion, and then I can make sure that I'm talking about the things that actually interest all of you. But to begin with, I'm going to talk a little bit about this issue of housing and this great problem that we have here in Washington and in basically every other city in the country, especially our big coastal cities, which is that we don't have enough housing. And as a consequence, housing has become increasingly unaffordable. I expect that it's an issue for some of you in your own lives or in the lives of members of your family, that it has become increasingly difficult to find affordable housing in the places where we want to live. And the question is basically, how did that happen? Where did we go wrong? For much of human history, the cities that have been the most prosperous have also been the places to which people moved. And so the economic growth of a city and the growth of its population closely tracked each other. Cities were magnets. They drew people to opportunity. And when a city prospered, people wanted to be there, and they came there and they lived there, and the city made room for them. And in the United States and in some other developed countries, we've now reversed that pattern. It's now the case that our most prosperous cities, and Washington, D.C. is certainly on that list, have stopped growing relative to the rest of the countries in which they sit. They've become the places where it's hardest for people to move and to build new lives. And so this very old and important pattern in which cities that prospered also grew and provided more and more housing has been broken. And the story of how that happened is, to me, at the heart of many of our problems in this country. I think that the lack of housing is a key issue that explains a lot of the other issues that we are confronting as a country. And so it's important not just because having a roof over your head is one of the most important things for anyone, but because our inability to put roofs over our heads also explains some of the other issues that we're having as a nation, and I'll come back to that a bit later. So what's going on in Washington? In a nutshell, the problem is very simple. We don't build enough new housing to keep pace with the growth of our population. And even more so, we don't build enough new housing to accommodate all of the people who would like to live here and to contribute to our community. And the reason that that's happened can sort of be broken into a couple of chunks, one of which is the story of Capitol Hill. So Capitol Hill, as I expect many of you know, and probably know better than I do, began as a community largely of workforce housing. It was a place populated substantially by people who worked, at the Navy Yard or at other small businesses on the Hill. There were some homes for the wealthy, but it was mostly a community of relatively working class, middle class people who worked for a living, often in businesses that were either in their homes or adjacent to their homes. The Hill was dotted with small businesses and enterprises. It was an extremely economically diverse community, and its housing stock was extremely diverse as well. And what has happened over the last 50 years, really, is that the Hill has homogenized. The type of housing is increasingly limited, or has increasingly turned toward single-family homes. The row homes that many of us live in and know and love, many of them were essentially multifamily housing for much of their existence. But on my block, for example, even in the last 2 decades, roughly half of the houses on the block have removed what were once separate basement apartments and incorporated them into the main living unit. And so the number of people living in those structures has gradually declined. If you look at a census record from the 1940s and compare it to the present day, what you find is that on the average block on Capitol Hill, the number of people who live there has been reduced by roughly half. Half as many people live on the average Capitol Hill block as did 100 years ago. Which to me is very striking. There are, of course, many reasons why the corner stores that once dotted the Hill are no longer nearly as common as they once were. One is that Safeway and other supermarket chains now dominate the grocery business. But another is that the density of the Hill has noticeably declined. The number of people living on each block is smaller than it used to be. That's not just because the number of units has declined. It's also because the number of people in each household has also declined. Families have fewer children. People are more likely to live by themselves or with a partner instead of living with members of their extended family. So, again, if you go back to these old census records, what you see in a neighborhood like this is that a family might have consisted of a mother and father, several children, a couple of boarders, perhaps an aunt or a great aunt, perhaps some grandparents, all living as part of a single family unit. And today that's much less common. And so you've seen this decline in the population. The reason this is important is the first point about what has changed about DC is that the housing we already had accommodates fewer people than it used to. So the number of people who live in these neighborhoods, these old neighborhoods, is smaller than it used to be. The second issue, of course, is that we built out from the center of our cities at relatively low densities. So the Hill is quite a dense neighborhood in terms of the number of buildings per acre or whatever other unit of measurement you want to use. But as you go out into the suburbs, you get one house per quarter acre, one house per half acre. There are parts of Virginia, or Maryland as well, not that far distant from downtown DC, where an average of one home per acre or even less than that is the status quo. And that means, of course, that many fewer people can live on that land and in proximity to the city. And so the pattern of development also began to restrict the number of people who could live in the available land. Through much of human history, there's been a fairly constant rule about how large a city can become. And that rule is that cities are basically limited by commute time. It needs to be possible for people to get to their jobs and back home in a single day. In the era of walking and horses, that meant that cities were relatively compact. In the era of cars, it means that cities can be considerably larger, but there's still an outer limit. And when you reach that outer limit, that land, that area around DC, is determined by that daily commute. And if you're using that land for homes on a single acre or even a quarter acre, there will be many fewer homes that can accommodate people in the urban area. So that's the second limit on DC's growth. And then the third limit, and in some ways the most important at this point, is that we have strictly regulated what can be built on the land in DC proper and in the areas around DC. And the most strict form of that is the restriction of land for use for single-family detached homes, the sort of standard American dream home that Americans sort of visualize as being and it is in our country the standard form of housing. In the city of DC, in the District of Columbia, 36% of the land is reserved for single-family detached homes. That sometimes startles people when I tell them that. They don't believe me, but it's true. If you look at a zoning map of DC, what you'll see is that most of Northwest, a substantial portion of Northeast, and even some of Southeast is reserved exclusively for single-family detached homes. The effect of that is that that land can't be used to house more people. It's basically, and I'll explain why I'm saying this in a second, but it's basically a subsidy for the owners of those homes. It is the case that they are the recipients of a government welfare program that enables them to live on that land more cheaply than they would otherwise be able to. Without single-family zoning, many of them could not afford to live on that land. And the reason is that if you are a resident, let's pick on Cleveland Heights for a moment. If you're a resident of Cleveland Heights and you live in a nice single-family home there, the price of that home is basically determined by how much anyone will pay for a single-family home, because you can't build 2 units or 3 units or 4 units on that land. If it were legal to build 4 units on that land, there wouldn't be any single-family homes left in Cleveland Park. You'd have basically, a bunch of apartment buildings. Each of those units would be less expensive than the house that now sits on the land, but the total value of the structure would be significantly greater. And so the only reason the homeowner in Cleveland Park can afford to keep their house is because it's illegal to build more housing on their land. And that has the effect of limiting the number of people who can live in DC. And in this city, as in other cities, what we see basically is that it's the single most important reason that the city is no longer affordable is that we have decided to prevent people from building as much housing as is needed and wanted in order to subsidize the lifestyle of the owners of single-family homes. So that, in a nutshell, is the explanation of what is causing our housing shortage. It is often the case that people say, well, what if we subsidize, the construction of housing for people who really need it? Like, not everybody's going to be able to live here, but we have an affordable housing problem. Let's build affordable housing for the people who need it. Or let's build apartment buildings for young people around transit stations, or let's do other forms of intervention to address specific pieces of this problem. And all of that is important, and I'm happy to talk more about the pieces of it, but none of it is going to be sufficient to the broader challenge of providing enough housing. The only way we can really do that is by taking the land that we have and using it differently than we're using it now. Mary mentioned in the introduction that one of the things that I have written about is the problem of historic districts. This is one of the more controversial things that I write about. People don't like it very much when I say this, but it is my view that historic districts are generally a bad idea. Not the preservation of specific historic buildings, which may have considerable civic and cultural value, but the idea that an entire area should be preserved in its present form is basically a form of protectionism for a particular lifestyle that wouldn't otherwise be possible. And the beneficiaries are better off, without question. We all like living on Capitol Hill. But the rest of the community is worse off as a consequence, because we're reserving neighborhoods for the people who live in them, rather than asking the question of how do we serve the needs of everyone in this community. And so I think that this tendency to say we're going to set off large chunks of our city as essentially living museums is sort of the extreme form of the single-family zoning phenomenon. It's another way in which we use government regulation to prevent people from getting what they need, to prevent people from getting the housing that they need. And it is a sense in which many of us who think of ourselves as liberal and committed to ideals of social equality and social justice are in fact not living those ideals, are in fact engaged in supporting a system that very specifically prevents less fortunate members of our community from having the opportunity to build better lives here and to live in the places they want to live, to get to the jobs they need to get to as a consequence of the choices that we're making. So I'm going to come to questions, but I said at the outset that it's my view that these housing issues are at the root of many of our other problems, and I've just suggested a little bit of what I mean by that, which is that fundamental issues like the equality of our society are adversely affected by people's inability to live in the places where opportunity is greatest. So in Washington, D.C., and in San Francisco, and in New York, and in our other most prosperous cities where opportunity is concentrated, where people have the best chance to have high-paying jobs, it's simply impossible for many people to live. And as a result, they're excluded from those opportunities. They're excluded from the infrastructure of schools and public transit and public amenities, our lovely free museums here, for example, that are so available and accessible to the people who are lucky enough to live in the core of DC. All of that is only available to people who are fortunate, and because of our housing policies, not available to many members of the population. So I think issues of access to opportunity and equality are part of our housing problems. Issues of health are implicated. Long commutes are bad for people. Living outside of cities is bad for people. The environment is implicated. The single greenest way to live is in density in cities. The lowest carbon emissions per resident in the United States are on the island of Manhattan. The denser the community, the greener the community, the lower the impact on the greater environment. And so, in all of these respects, our ability to live in cities that continue to evolve to meet our needs is something that we need to restore and get back to. If we can find ways of doing that, find ways of allowing new growth and transformation in our cities, we will all be better off. There's a bunch of ways that I could take this, but I really do want to hear from you all what would be most interesting for you. I see there's a couple of comments in the chats. I'm happy to address those. I'm happy to take questions and hear the direction you'd like to take the conversation. But let me turn it over to Mary, and she can field questions from you all and direct the rest of this conversation.
One question I'm going to ask, and then I'll get to the chat questions, is can you point to a city in the world that has done it right, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll mention two that are of particular interest to me. I'll mention one that's in the United States, which is Houston, which is a city that it's the only large city in America that doesn't have a zoning code. In other words, it doesn't have a set of rules that say how much housing can be built on any given parcel of land. There are other limitations. It's not the Wild West. You can't do whatever you want, but Houston has been singularly permissive in allowing the construction of new housing and denser housing. And what you actually see in large swaths of Houston, uniquely, is that they're building new versions of Capitol Hill. It turns out that townhome neighborhoods are a level of density that a lot of people really like. there's a certain amount of demand for high rises, right? Like a lot of the time when I say denser housing, people jump instantly to a vision of Manhattan's rows of high rises. And obviously that's extremely dense housing, but the demand for that form of housing is, at least in the United States, limited. It is primarily, single people, younger people, older people who want to live there. The demand among families for that type of housing is pretty limited and probably will remain that way as long as there are, the alternatives of single family tract housing. But what people do have a lot of demand for is neighborhoods like Capitol Hill, townhome style housing with walkable amenities and public transit. And what you see in Houston is that developers have found that that's sort of the highest and best use of large portions of that city's land. So in most of the United States, it's illegal to build anything that resembles Capitol Hill. The type of housing in which people in this community live is simply illegal. It's too dense. The streets are too narrow. The accessibility of services is too limited, and they won't let you do it. But in Houston, they do, and what we see is that there's a huge unmet demand for it. I mean, the prices on the Hill are also an indication that there's a huge unmet demand for it. But when you actually go somewhere and say, okay, you can do this if you want to, it turns out that people do it because they do want to. So Houston is the first one that I'd mention. But really the outstanding example of a city that has largely surmounted these challenges is Tokyo in Japan. I spent a little less than a month in Tokyo, actually, this past summer, reporting on its housing policies, which I find fascinating, and wrote a big piece, which appeared in the Times in August, I think, looking at how Tokyo had been so successful. And the real magic there is two things. So the first thing to say is just to describe it. Tokyo is the world's largest city. It's the world's largest city because it has continued to make room for new housing. And as a result, it has remained affordable. It has managed to build enough new housing so that families can still easily afford to find places to live. People can can run their own businesses or make other lifestyle choices that are not aimed at maximizing their ability to pay rent. They don't need to be lobbyists to live in the nice neighborhoods. They can, continue to run craft shops or to, pursue their passions because the housing costs are just much lower there. So what's the secret? What does Tokyo do differently than American cities? And the answer is two things. The first is that they are completely unsentimental about allowing the city to be rebuilt repeatedly. And as a consequence, the average Tokyo house lasts about 20 to 30 years before it's knocked down and replaced by new housing. So they're constantly rebuilding their neighborhoods and their city. And there's a certain amount of disruption associated with that, and undoubtedly a certain amount of loss of community and of the history of the city. But the effect is to constantly be replenishing the housing supply and to make room for what the people who live there now need. So that's one piece of the formula. The second is continued investment in public transit. So they work very hard to extend the area in which people can plausibly live at density by constantly building new train lines and improving the service on existing train lines and making it possible for the city to spread and expand. And so New York, our great metropolis, the one city in America with really comprehensive public transit services, hasn't really expanded its public transit system since the 1960s. It's been pretty much frozen in place since that time. Tokyo in that time has roughly doubled the size of its public transit system and continues to make huge investments in new lines and new services. And those two policies, a commitment to building new housing and a commitment to making that housing usable to the people who live in it, have made a huge difference. It's nothing we couldn't do, but it's stuff that we don't do.
Gail Cohn, did you want to unmute and ask your questions?
I just want to ask you about accessory dwelling units. and the way that Arlington has gone in terms of their changes, and whether we should think about changing our laws accordingly.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. So for those who may not be familiar, an accessory dwelling unit is basically a secondary unit on a property, a basement apartment, an apartment above a garage, even a freestanding structure in a backyard. They are common on the Hill. Many people still have apartments in their basements in particular. And there has been a movement around the country to modify single-family zoning in particular to allow for the construction of these secondary structures, which typically then become rental apartments, although they can also be used to house family members. And California has legalized ADUs basically throughout the state. Seattle and Washington State have a huge experiment with it. A bunch of municipalities around the country, and as you mentioned, Arlington, closer to home, have really been pursuing this as a way of expanding the housing supply. So I'd say about it that I think it's a very good idea. I think basically anything that liberalizes our ability to construct more housing in existing neighborhoods, particularly inner core neighborhoods, is extremely important and valuable. And so I think it's great that we're seeing that experiment here in at least some communities. Montgomery County is another community that's been trying to liberalize ADU zoning as well. But for DC proper, it has limited value. So as I mentioned earlier, about a third of the city is zoned for single family housing. So in Northwest, you can imagine in particular that making it easier to build ADUs could make a real difference. In our neighborhood, ADUs are already essentially legal, and as I said, common. And in general, it's a relatively small change. So it's not saying that you can replace a single family house with 2 or 4 units. It's saying you can add a smaller scale apartment. There's a need for it. It's great, but it's a relatively small step relative to our broader needs. So I think of it as kind of a gateway drug, a way of getting people to engage with the case for allowing more housing and to embrace a change that's relatively low impact, that relatively non-disruptive to existing community fabric. And then maybe you can build on that to build support for larger scale change.
Norm Metzger, did you want to ask your question here?
Yeah, I want to address the issue of values. South of Capitol Hill proper, of course, is Navy Yard, and the construction there has been enormous. And the architecture is hardly distinguished. It's pretty ugly, but it's well populated. To the north of Capitol Hill has been H Street, which at one time used to be a kind of a gritty, but kind of an attractive area of small shops, basically low-income population. But much of that H Street vibe is gone and replaced again by very large, in my opinion, ugly apartment houses. Capitol Hill property, mainly and solely, you might say, because of historic preservation, has not had that disaster visited on it. Instead, it's become what I like to call a 15-minute neighborhood, a neighborhood of attractive houses, which are often modified and hardly stable, shops, a place that's become a tourist attraction. And I guess my question is, what do you see in the values of that? Do you see Capitol Hill as a valuable neighborhood for what it's become? Or you think as a disaster because it doesn't have all those large, ugly apartment houses?
So I mean, I think that Capitol Hill is a lovely neighborhood, and I like it and live here. I think that apartment buildings have their place, however. We need to find room for more apartment buildings. And one thing that I'd note is that part of the reason that DC has this pattern of sort of boxes that are built to the absolute limits of the permissible envelope is because we so tightly restrict the permissible envelope. If you strictly limit development opportunities, and this is true for commercial construction downtown as well, if you have laws that essentially suppress possible supply well below the level of demand, what you're going to find is that everything's going to get built out to the absolute limit of capacity. And that's exactly what you see in Navy Yard, is sort of this unrelieved series of boxes that are a response to those market conditions. Listen, the problem, the fundamental problem is that we have limited our ability to create new Capitol Hills. And so what you have is a situation in which a lot of people love this neighborhood and would like to live in it or something like it. And they simply can't do that because we're not creating new versions of it. One of the things that I was trying to say about Tokyo a moment earlier is that the way that Tokyo avoids homogenization is by building abundance of housing. So it creates lots of new neighborhoods that have some of the characteristics that people want: transit accessibility, local restaurants and shops and markets, the ability to live without a car, or at least largely without a car. And that takes the pressure off of the existing places. And what it means is that instead of having a neighborhood like Capitol Hill that needs to be protected strictly by laws that have the effect essentially of handing a huge windfall to the people who happen to live here, you have enough places like Capitol Hill that anybody who wants to live in one can afford to do so. And there's not the same kind of pressure to convert it into something else. So what we're really wrestling with, I think, is not the question of whether, you know, Capitol Hill should become another Navy Yard. We've created that situation for ourselves by limiting any possibility of developing places like Capitol Hill, you know, in newer parts of our community.
Gail mentioned Portland, Oregon, I believe, which 4 years ago ended single-family zoning. Do you know how that's worked for them in this short time?
Yeah, so Portland is one of a number of communities that have taken this jump. Minneapolis was the first, and I've spent quite a bit of time in Minneapolis looking at the effects of that change in law. Portland has followed. Seattle, a bunch of the West Coast has done this now. The state of California has passed a state law that essentially does it in every city above, I forget what it is, maybe it's 50,000 people, something like that. So these laws, early days, you know, one thing that I think, you know, people often sort of have in their mind when they think about these changes is that, you know, if you legalize denser development, you'll sort of instantly or quickly convert a neighborhood. When you legalize existing development, the people who live there have the right to keep living there. Nothing forces them to sell their townhome and allow it to be replaced by a condominium. You know, the best estimates, people have looked carefully at this, estimate that in a situation where a change in law has allowed higher density development, and that higher density development is economically attractive, meaning that, you know, prices are high enough that it's worth it to build, say, a 2-unit structure on the land that currently is a 1-unit structure, that the maximum pace of replacement is about 1.5% of existing structures per year, which is to say that it would take half a century for a neighborhood to be completely converted following a change in law, assuming that the economics remained attractive throughout that period. So these are very slow processes. It takes time to build. It takes a lot of time to get the permits, to get the property, to build the structure. And so, you know, these laws that have changed in the last 5 years, you know, it's really too early to see a lot of change on the ground. Although we do see, you know, increases in people pulling building permits and investing in development in these cities that have gotten rid of single family zoning, but it's slow. And the other really important point is that zoning is just one layer in a set of obstacles that city governments have created to preserve the lifestyle of their incumbent residents. And it is often the case that when cities get rid of one of those layers, enough of them remain to really prevent significant change. That can be historic preservation measures, it can be parking requirements, it can be building code restrictions. There are a lot of different ways to prevent people from actually building. And part of the story in places like Portland and Minneapolis and a bunch of these California cities is that at least for now, the existing residents are successfully resisting new development by invoking those other laws and continuing to prevent construction on a large scale. And it will be interesting to see whether there's enough momentum to remove those barriers as well.
Joel Kelty asks if you could also discuss the Portland/Oregon urban growth boundary.
Yeah, that is a concept borrowed, is very common. So the idea, for those who are not familiar, is that they drew basically a line on a map around the metropolitan area and said, basically, we're going to restrict development outside of this boundary and allow denser development inside of it. We're going to try to create a boundary line between the city and the rural area around it. This is a very common idea in Europe. Those who've traveled in Europe will be familiar with the phenomenon of leaving a city in a way that doesn't happen in the United States, of literally like crossing a line after which you're in farmland, as opposed to sort of the endless sprawl at the edge of American cities. And the idea in Portland was to emulate that and to focus growth in this urban core area. Montgomery County's farmland reserve is a similar idea, but Portland has the most aggressive version in the United States. The long and the short of it is that it has been difficult to enforce, and I think is generally regarded as having been not entirely successful. American land use law strongly favors owners, except in cities, basically. So if you've got sort of an overriding zoning code, you can effectively limit development, but it's been very hard to limit development outside of the urban growth boundary in Portland. And so I think that policy is largely regarded as having been an interesting but largely unsuccessful experiment.
Mike Silverstein, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. The history of DC is somewhat uncomfortable racially. There were certain neighborhoods that were built here specifically excluding Black folks, racial covenants, things like that. And we are still living with the legacy of that, trying our best to get away from it. And I'd like to ask you if you think that the current zoning laws in DC lead to pressure on our historic working class neighborhoods that are often African American, and talk about the resulting gentrification and displacement, because young people want to have their houses, and there's nowhere else for them to go.
Yeah, there's sort of two different issues there. They're both important. The first is that the history of zoning is a history of racism. The reason that cities adopted zoning codes was to prevent Black people from living in white neighborhoods. It's really that simple. And the earliest zoning codes said that. And then the Supreme Court ruled in the 19-teens that it was illegal to say it out loud. And so very quickly, cities led by Euclid in Ohio figured out ways of writing codes that achieved this racist purpose without actually saying it out loud. And so the point of single-family zoning was essentially to exclude lower income and specifically Black families from living in the nice parts of town. That's why it was created and why it was implemented across the country. And because our legacy of racism means that these economic disparities persist, it means that the racial disparities persist too. And so one clear consequence of this type of restriction on housing development and preservation of these homogeneous single-family communities is that it enforces the segregation of our communities along racial lines as well. And I think that's a continuing tragedy and a continuing problem. One great one great benefit of diversifying the housing stock in communities across the country is that it diversifies the communities in other ways as well. So that's with regard to the history of zoning. And I think it's important that people understand that history because these policies were implemented with malice and intent. So the second question is about gentrification and displacement, which is kind of a different issue. It's saying, if you look now at the neighborhoods that are, some of the neighborhoods in DC that historically had large African-American populations in particular, and were located in the urban core, they've become some of the most desirable neighborhoods. And you get sort of this bidding war where the people with the most money get to live there. And the effect, for the same reasons, is that those neighborhoods are increasingly losing their African-American populations. So listen, as I said a moment ago, I think one big issue that American cities have is because we've limited the opportunity to construct new desirable neighborhoods, new versions of Capitol Hill or of Shaw or of Logan Circle, it puts much more pressure on the existing ones. Instead of giving people a greater set of opportunities to choose this lifestyle, if the only opportunity is to do so in these historically African-American communities, the gentrification becomes inevitable and irresistible. And that is clearly a big part of the story of DC in recent decades, absolutely. Gentrification, however, I think is a really complicated story. And it can be a force for progress, and it can be a force for good. I think, it is a way of revitalizing neighborhoods that desperately need investment. It can bring new retail and business and cultural opportunities to neighborhoods. And in particular, when it's combined with, public investment in maintaining affordable housing, I think, it can be, there are ways of making it better for more people. And I think DC actually has some success stories in that regard, although clearly a lot of work to do.
Thank you.
Karen Brannon, have we answered your questions?
I had one that I don't think was answered. Thank you so much for sharing your wonderful experience and knowledge. I was wondering, I just watched a very disheartening documentary about the Liberty City effort to create mixed race housing down in Miami. And I've seen a few other situations like that. And I'm wondering if you have any examples of successful or even semi-successful mixed race and mixed income housing development in this country.
Yeah, I would say that, the best examples of it were not intentional, right? Like the places that have been most successful in maintaining mixed race and mixed income communities are not as a result of sort of centrally planned housing projects for the most part. There's a couple of exceptions I want to talk about in a second, but they're organic. They're places in which a diverse housing stock has been maintained and has allowed a diverse community to flourish and to persist. And there are really interesting examples of it, in some of our post-industrial cities. Pittsburgh comes to mind. It's a place where, you have a lot of diversity in the housing stock and a surprising amount of, of neighborhoods that have these, relatively diverse characters because the housing stock is diverse. And so, if you're sort of going to pick one ingredient that really matters for this stuff, it's maintaining a lot of different kinds of housing. And when you start knocking down the smaller units, the apartment buildings, the subsidized projects, that has a homogenizing effect on neighborhoods. And so our most diverse neighborhoods tend to be our older neighborhoods that for one reason or another have avoided the wrecking ball, and that have, a housing stock that's attractive to at least some, more affluent families, and enough of a diversity of housing stock that other kinds of less affluent families can also afford to live there. To the extent that there are exceptions, they're interesting. They tend to revolve around two things. One is that some of the big corporate factory towns were very successful efforts to create diverse communities. Some of the big auto factory towns or places like Alcoa, Tennessee, or there's one in Pennsylvania. I'm blanking on the name right now, but corporations that hired large numbers of workers in the mid-century and were pretty race-blind in their hiring policies, at least in some periods, often created communities that were strikingly diverse. And in some of them, that diversity has really persisted. So that's one great exception. And it's an interesting one because it sort of runs against some of our intuitions about maybe who the good guys are. But there are enough examples of it that I think it's really worth taking note of. And the other success story, which is particular to New York, but has broader applicability, is that New York's government subsidized middle-class housing projects in the mid-century, large-scale developments that had income requirements, but were intentionally not for people who we would ordinarily think of as the targets of affordable housing development, but were instead, more middle class. It was a broader vision of the role that the government might play in the housing market. It is similar. So there are a number of European cities that have done this on a much larger scale. Vienna is the most important. The government there is the primary developer of housing. It doesn't mean everybody lives in government housing, but the bottom 2/3 of the income spectrum primarily live in government-built housing. And by broadening the portion of the housing market in which the government is active, you get projects that attracted a much more diverse community. And New York still has a number of examples of it, but the best examples are really in other countries. So those are two examples that I'd highlight. But it's really striking to me that the most diverse parts of the country tend to be the places where it sort of happened by accident.
Thank you. Interesting.
Sanju Misra, would you like to unmute and ask your question? That's a negative.
I can
I'll read it here. Density is an important factor in reducing housing costs, but annual escalation on rents is a problem too. What do you think about tools to control rent growth for non-owners? For example, rent control, subsidies like vouchers, or other approaches?
So rising rents are undoubtedly a huge problem. I really tend to regard them as a symptom of our lack of housing supply. I really think that the best way to keep rents under control is to build a lot more housing. And our experience with rent control is really mixed. It is a short-term stabilizer. It undoubtedly has the effect of allowing people to avoid rent increases in the short term, but it also clearly discourages new construction, discourages landlords from investing in building upkeep, and results in high rates of vacancy, among other things. And so it's a really inefficient way of achieving the goal. If we want to think of the goal as making sure that people have affordable places to live, my read of the literature on rent control is that it works for the population that is living in a place at the time that it begins, and for some decades even. But over time, it has really negative consequences for that community. And communities that have tried it have tended eventually to drop it for that reason. Although there's a new wave of communities considering it because of its short-term attractions. So I'm extremely wary of rent control. I think it can have a sort of a very specific and targeted virtue, but in general, I think it's not the right solution to our problems. Vouchers are a little different. I think vouchers are great. So the federal government's primary affordable housing program since the 1980s has been what's called the Section 8 program, which gives vouchers to families that can't afford housing that they can use to rent, in theory, anything. And the problem with that program is that there's two problems. The first is that only a third of the families that need the vouchers get them. It's a hugely underfunded program. And I think that making those vouchers basically a right, making them available to everyone who needs them, would be a huge way to address the need for housing in this country. It would be a huge improvement. But if it's not married to an increase in supply, it has also bad effects because it means it's like a game of musical chairs. It means more people are chasing after the same number of chairs. And so it really, everyone who needs one should get a voucher, but in order for that to meaningfully improve the situation, you got to build a lot of new housing too. So I guess the short answer is, at the end of the day, I just don't think there's anything more important than building a lot more housing.
Gail, you've had a couple more questions. Would you like to unmute and follow up?
I'm particularly interested in your comments on what we have going on downtown with too many buildings that are vacated and the interest in changing them into residential housing.
Yeah, so this is an issue in DC and in many other cities right now. The pandemic has really altered the contours of the office market, at least for the time being. There's much less demand for these structures. The federal government appears to have permanently reduced its need for office space and other tenants as well. It is really, so in theory, it's great to promote the transformation of some of those structures into housing. They're well located. It's an obvious place to build more housing. And we're already seeing some of it, and undoubtedly we'll see more. I think people sometimes underestimate the technical obstacles. A commercial building tends to have a lot of interior space that is pretty far from the windows. And housing, by contrast, needs windows. The law literally requires it, but even if you change the law so that you can have, for example, bedrooms without windows, a bedroom is legally defined as a room with a window. Even if you change that law, you still need to convince people to live in rooms without windows. The bottom line is that a lot of the floor plates in those buildings are surprisingly unattractive for residential development. And really, like, if you really want to develop large-scale residential in those spaces, it more likely involves knocking down the whole building and starting again in some of those cases. So that's not impossible, but it means that it's a lot more expensive than sort of the vision of just building apartments into existing structures. Many of those structures can't easily be converted.
Mike Silverstein, would you like to mention Pittsburgh's history?
Yeah, you mentioned Pittsburgh, and that's home. And the reason essentially that Pittsburgh has a great housing market is because of the disaster of the collapse of the steel industry that you had. And this is why some cities have a better situation than others. The population cratered from 686,000 in the 1950 census to barely over 300,000 in 2010. And as such, you had all these homes that had been built in the early 20th century when the city was quite wealthy. The bones were terrific, and everybody had moved out. And to an extent, this is what happened in a lot of basically every American city in the 1950s and 60s when people moved to the suburbs. And you had so much housing in the inner city that was, what can we say, devalued from what it had been. And in Pittsburgh, you had all these places, Lawrenceville, South Side, the old industrial areas. Suddenly, young people who are going to Carnegie Mellon University and places like that are saying, we can live here and we can afford it. Other cities don't have that. And the areas in Washington that may have people where white folks had fled after the riots are now all gentrified. But there is this, the problem, as you say, and it is absolutely true, is there is just not enough housing anywhere in this country in terms of what our needs have been. In Pittsburgh, they did not build a single family house in the city limits for over 25 years.
Yeah, I mean, there's two ways to get housing abundance, right? One is to build a lot of new housing, and the other is to get rid of a large share of your population. So
Bingo.
What makes Pittsburgh interesting is that it is in a position, or has been, it's actually coming out of that period now. It's been successful enough that it's reaching, it has its own housing problems, but it was in a position of housing abundance. But it gives us an idea of what it would look like to live in a city where there was enough housing. Because
Precisely.
what you get is, as you said, young families can build lives there. Artists can pay a rent low enough to allow them to do art. Small businesses can pay a rent low enough to allow them to build small businesses. Older residents can stay in their homes and afford it more easily. These are all of the benefits of housing abundance, and what makes places like Pittsburgh really interesting to me is that they're examples of it. They're examples of it for a very sad reason, as you point out. I mean, there was an economic collapse there, I'm not recommending that as the route to housing abundance for other American cities, but it does show what you get. It shows the benefits of making room for more housing.
Lee Reno asks, would you care to comment on the building height restrictions in DC?
Yes, they're terrible. Yeah, so I hear the case for imposing height limits on the federal core and adjacent areas. The sight lines, the view sheds, are a national patrimony and well and good. I understand that. Why it is that when you drive out to Friendship Heights, buildings suddenly get taller the moment you cross the line into Maryland. Why Silver Spring is high rises and the adjacent part of DC is not. Why it would be so easy to for economic development into Southeast DC by allowing the construction of high rises on some of that land that no tourist would ever see. I find it incredibly frustrating that Congress has prevented DC from retaining more of its natural market and instead, pushing the skyscrapers across the river to Roslyn and Pentagon City and Crystal City. It's just stupid and sad and frustrating.
All right, we're almost at the top of the hour. Any last questions, folks? This is your chance. Okay.
Mary, Joanna
Yes.
has had her hand up all night.
Who has?
Call on Joanna.
Oh, Joanna then. I'm sorry I didn't see you. I can't see everyone. I can't unmute you though. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay. Yes, hi. Height limits, we're talking about densification, but part of the non-densifying how we live is personal choices of a lot of us. Capitol Hill, most of it is zoned, I believe, for 2 dwellings per property, per row house. Additions and renovations to many houses on Capitol Hill right now are not creating in that lovely historic row house, but doing 6 bedrooms, 6 baths, or, and 3 family rooms dwellings. That's a choice. How much space we need in any size of apartments is rather high compared to some other countries. How much elbow room I need to be happy in my apartment. I find it extremely frustrating to watch. Of course, we haven't converted our house into 2 apartments, but how do we help people make those better decisions, which also could bring a little income for the rental? It's frustrating to think about it, but we as a society seem to be saying, don't do more then, but don't encourage us to live up to even that limit.
Yeah, maybe the way to answer that question is to say that the room that I'm sitting in right now is the basement of my row home. It was an apartment when we purchased the property. We maintained it as an apartment until our two children needed more space. I would gladly have built another floor on top of our house, but it is illegal to do that. I would have preferred to maintain an apartment in the basement to receive the rent from that property. Frankly, for me, it would have been important to maintain a relatively affordable apartment. I care about that. But it was impossible to do that and to stay on the hill. That was our choice. And it was our choice because of the historic preservation laws that make it illegal to add a story to my building, even though there are townhomes in close proximity that have that extra story because they happened to get it in 1910. And therefore it's legal for them, but not for me. So when I talk about the problems with historic preservation, that is what I'm talking about, is that the city of Washington, D.C. prevented me from adding a story to my townhome that would have allowed me to preserve an affordable apartment in my basement. And they do this at scale. That's the story of several other properties on my block and innumerable other properties on Capitol Hill. And this is actually this isn't even a change that would really affect the aesthetics of the neighborhood. I would argue that if someone wants to knock down their townhome and replace it with an apartment building, that should be legal too. But even if you feel like that goes too far and you want to preserve the fabric of townhomes on Capitol Hill, the insanity of insisting that the number of stories that happened to be in place in 1940 should endure forevermore. These are the things that we're doing that don't make any sense and that have a real cost for our communities.
Well, this is interesting because I know that I am a Capitol Hill Restoration Society member, and we see a lot of projects where the third floor is being added onto the houses in a historic district. There are some restrictions of what's visible, etc. But it is, and it can be done, and but I haven't studied the zoning across the whole area. So, yeah. Okay.
Okay, folks, with respect to everyone's time, we're going to have to call it a night. But thank you so much for your
Thank you
time.
so much to think about.
Thank
We
you.
really
Thank you
appreciate
so
it.
much.
Quite good. Thank you.
My pleasure. Have a good night.
You too.
Bye. Bye.